Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where everybody's at. Just want to start off by sending just a heartfelt thanks and appreciation to everybody who has put so much time and so much effort into creating these framework for conservation action for the West. We have really had an all hands on deck effort to pool expertise, talent, resources, and develop, some really innovative products that I think will serve our agency, serve the landowners and the partners that we work with, and serve the resource just incredibly well for many years to come. So although Dave Naugle and I have the distinct privilege of sharing some of these highlights and preview of the frameworks with you today, know that this is just an incredible team effort across the whole country, pulling together to make these happen. So be remiss not really, again, just really calling everybody out and thanking everybody for the contributions. So let me just confirm with everybody that they're seeing the screen. Thumbs up, Dave, do you see it? Yep, perfect. So our goals for today are relatively straightforward. The first thing that we want to do is really review Jimmy's charge to update the Western Working Lands for Wildlife strategies. Next, we're going to recall the steps taken to arrive here today. I see, looking at the participant list here, it's not only a collection of folks that have been with us for a long time, but also a lot of new faces just even in the last 6 months. And so I want to make sure we go through and refresh, the steps that we've taken so far to get where we're at. 3 would be to describe the utility and the benefits of these frameworks, as well as identify anticipated outcomes. We'll preview some of the highlights associated with these, and then discuss public rollout next steps, and Clint's going to help us facilitate that discussion at the end. So with that, we'll jump right in. So Working Lands for Wildlife for a decade now has served us very well. It's based on a shared vision, right, of achieving wildlife conservation through sustainable agriculture. We focus on threats that are mutually impacting wildlife and agriculture, and we do that through sustainable practices on working landscapes. It's an approach that's led us to be able to implement enough of the right practices in the right places to bring about measurable benefits to wildlife, populations of wildlife. And it's also highlighted our partnership with science and academia to continually assess the effectiveness of our applied practices, quantify benefits that allow us to not only continue to adapt and improve program delivery, but to share that working land story as we move forward. To date, just look at the number. I mean, it's incredible. We've got 7,400 individual private landowners who have partnered with us across this country to conserve over 10 million acres of working lands. Out west, a lot of that focus has been centered on conserving rangeland habitat using 3 different bird species to act as umbrellas for broader landscapes. So we have the sage grouse, we have the lesser prairie chicken, and the southwestern willow flycatcher that have helped us to focus resources to conserve those rangelands in the areas depicted on the map. That all, in order to build on those accomplishments and incorporate the 2018 Farm Bill. I keep saying the new Farm Bill, and then I hear Jimmy talk about the upcoming 2023 Farm Bill. It kind of blows my mind, but to think about where we're at right now, it's really to build on that past decade of accomplishments and to engage the full power of the current Farm Bill. Jimmy gave us a charge, with the regional conservationists back last summer, and it was threefold. Number one, we were asked to work together to update our existing strategy under the Sage Grouse Initiative to cover another 5 years, so fiscal 21 through 25. 2 was to rebuild the Lesser Prairie Chicken Initiative as a much broader, holistic, Great Plains-wide grassland initiative for the same time period. And then thirdly was to uh, update our short-term milestones for the southwestern willow flycatcher for the next 2 years while we begin those discussions and reimagine how we could potentially alter or change that initiative, capitalizing on some of the lessons learned in the former in the future. So again, 3 steps. Today we're going to focus on the sage grouse and the lesser prairie chicken charge. Know that we have already accomplished our milestone of updates for the southwestern willow flycatcher. So how did we get here? Number one, June 25th last summer, Jimmy summoned us. We got together, had a leadership kickoff meeting. This is where the state conservationists and our leaders really developed a vision and a path forward. They selected their teams of who were going to work to put this together. We followed that up in the middle of summer, mid-July, where we brought all of those state designated teams together. And we had breakout sessions. And these were technical sessions where we prepared those states and partners for breakout with their staff and partners. State conservationists, then they did the heavy lift, and they led meetings within their own geographies with their own partners to really, roll up their sleeves and figure out what threats they were going to work on, where they were going to work on, get into the details of it all, and develop their individual state contributions that they then provided back to the Western Working Lands for Wildlife team to do an amalgamation of all of those individual contributions and sew them into broad biome level frameworks. That is where we're at today, is to review the aggregated accomplishments of all of this effort. And here they are. In the Outlook invite, you will see that attached are 2 documents. One is a PDF for the sagebrush biome. It's a framework for conservation action. And then that's paired with one for the Great Plains grasslands. And both of those documents are not only developed in a PDF format, but they're also have a companion digital resource that's also built online. And so you'll see as we go through this how the PDF, the hard copy, the old school way of doing business is now been enhanced with the creation of this online companion resource where we have things like all of those technical sessions, all of our slides, that were used in dissemination and building, all of the spatial data, the scientific, peer-reviewed literature that these foundations are built upon. All of that is consolidated and provided in this online resource, and together we then have this integrated Western Working Lands for Wildlife framework that has just a diversity of resources that we can use to conserve rangelands at biome scale. And there's a ton of benefits to us as an agency and for the producers we work with to have these biome level perspectives. And one of which is that we really now can speak to very large geographies and put regional context around local actions. And although all our conservation is done at that local level with those conservation districts, with those individual ranches and producers, it always benefits having a broader context of which to apply those actions. And that's exactly what these biome level plans do, is give us the ability at our fingertips to provide that regional context. Secondarily, it allows us to instill a working lands worldview very broadly. In the West, rangelands comprise 70% of all of the lands beneath our feet. Those lands not only underpin so many of the important rural economies, but also the wildlife, including the threatened and endangered wildlife. And this is where we get so many of our other resources associated with clean water, clean air. It's a big deal. 2/3 of that is stewarded by private landowners. And so again, now we have these frameworks that can put into regional context why this is such an important land use to work on, and why we have to make sure that the solutions for it are going to work for these men and women that steward these ranches, as well as the communities of which they serve. And so again, in working lands for wildlife, we are looking for that sweet spot where we have these intact landscape cores that overlap with, you know, robust wildlife populations, and where again people are part of that equation, and we have communities ready, willing, and able to move the needle. Frameworks also facilitate linkages to other regional efforts. Like Clint had mentioned in his introduction, there is a massive tri-national planning effort going right now to conserve central grasslands and create what they're calling this roadmap, where you literally have 3 countries negotiating, you know, what are the shared vision associated with this landscape? What are the threats? What are the actions we can do? On a little further west, we have the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and they are now inking what they're calling their sagebrush conservation strategy. Again, another very massive parallel effort that is much bigger than things that NRCS works on, but now our frameworks facilitate the ability to highlight the importance of private lands, of working lands, and of proactive voluntary conservation. And so now we can take these frameworks and with very simple communication, we can then tie those contributions to these broader frameworks. So think of this as that our frameworks are ultimately going to create a parking spot, a designated parking spot for voluntary conservation in the plans of both the Central Grasslands Roadmap and of WAFWA Sagebrush Strategy. So again, another really unique benefit that these are going to provide. Let me turn it over now to Dave Naugle. Dave, as many of you know, is a Western Working Lands for Wildlife Science Advisor, kind of partner in crime here, and he'll keep it rolling on some of the additional details. Dave?
Thanks, Tim. Incorporating all the latest advances in science and technology places these new frameworks on a solid foundation. The approach focuses on getting ahead of primary threats facing rangelands instead of ambulance chasing to save highly degraded sites with little or no chance of success. And with the advent of the Rangeland Analysis Platform, framework users now have access to spatial data to inform development of local strategies. Examples include spatial data across entire biomes that help you track cheatgrass invasion or identify areas of woodland expansion for treatment. These data are now linked to the frameworks and are available online at wlfw.rangelands.app. Next slide. We live in a don't just tell me, you have to show me society that constantly questions, how do you know that? So we embedded the scientific rationale behind each framework directly into today's documents. Now you see a superscript like the one on the left-hand side, the number 1, and you can click on it to see the title, abstract, and citation of the paper supporting the statement as shown on the right. And if you want to learn more or simply further judge for yourself, click again on the URL for free access to full documentation. Next slide. Acres enrolled, dollars allocated, and other archaic reporting requirements have been replaced by outcomes as the new gold standard by which the efficacy of Farm Bill investments are judged. Defined by Merriam's dictionary, outcomes are the way a story turns out, a consequence, Common synonyms include the upshot, the effect, or a conclusion. Outcomes provide a vital link to effective communications and outreach that help drive producer interest and sustained investment. The Working Lands for Wildlife Science team has published 53 outcome-based tools and evaluations since its inception and will continue to help NRCS quantify ranching and wildlife outcomes. A big shout out to Craig Derrickson, who before retiring as state conservationist in Nebraska, used a CCGA agreement to purchase Dirac Twidwell's time at University of Nebraska in Lincoln to bolster our ability to help quantify outcomes in the Great Plains. Back to you, Tim.
Yeah, thanks. And another benefit of having this framework at our fingertips is our ability to enhance communications even further and not only share broadly our successes, but also recruit new landowners, new partners to join the cause, join the campaign to conserve Western rangelands. You'll be pleased to know that we recently made a hire through our partnership with Pheasants Forever to bring Julia Debs on staff as the agricultural communications director that's going to be helping ratchet up communications surrounding the new frameworks. So Julia's comes to us from Kansas, where she has just a tremendous resume working with agricultural interests throughout the country, including most recently at the U.S. Grain Council. And she's going to help play a central role in writing strategic communication strategies that really enhance our ability to, again, not only increase the amount of participants, but also the amount of partners and elevate that working lands narrative in many other communication circles. So think of Julia as a conduit between our state public affairs specialists and our rock stars there at FPAC with Johnny and Justin and their team, to where together again we're going to elevate communications, bring that on par with our science and our tech transfer and our capacity to make sure that these strategies are fully supported on the communications front. Also know that these new frameworks are quote unquote climate smart. Climate smart mitigation action for rangelands, if you want to just quantify it, it's avoided conversion of grasslands or shrublands. The number one thing we can do to conserve the climate associated with rangelands is make sure the green grass stays green side up. Roughly speaking, 80 to 90% of all of the carbon is stored deep underground in the soils. And our job number one is to make sure it stays there. And so avoiding cultivation and conversion is job number one. After that, every other practice contained in these frameworks is designed to specifically bolster rangeland resilience, which is important because the resiliency enables the land, as well as the people and the wildlife, to adapt to ever-changing environments. So we can speak not only to what we're doing for mitigation, but also at helping communities adapt to changing environments. And the take-home message here is all of that has baked into the cake, so to speak, and it's a foundation of which these frameworks are built upon. Now that we've talked about some of the big picture benefits of having these biome level frameworks in the first place, let's dive into some of the details and hit some of the highlights. So in the Great Plains, woodland expansion in the Great Plains is a big deal. With the advent of the rangeland analysis platform, we've been able to use science in a new way to look at some of these resource concerns and see for the first time ever in scale what the impacts are actually occurring on the landscape. And so if you look on the figure on the left, where red is where intact grasslands have been invaded by expanding conifers, whether they're eastern red cedar in the north or honey mesquite in the south, you will see that a massive expansion has occurred in the last 2 decades as that red area has grown significantly. Put into quantified terms, think about 100 million acres of intact grasslands have now had woody species expanded upon. That has measurable and significant impacts to things like songbirds, to things like lesser prairie chicken. If you're a producer, you're very concerned about that because we have a lot of documentation showing the direct loss of forage as a result of this particular resource concern. On the right side, we can now pair that threat with our other known threat of land use conversion through direct conversion through cultivation. And for the first time ever, what this is revealing is the fact that our woodland expansion threat is dang near as big as the land use conversion threat. They are the two big drivers of grassland loss and degradation. Although people knew for a long time that this was occurring and that it was causing significant implications, I don't think anybody had an idea of the total scale at which this threat was actually happening. What that revelation and that knowledge has enabled NRCS and these new frameworks to do is to work with the academics, to work with our landowner partners, to come up with a new science-driven approach that will get ahead of this threat and not only halt that transition, but start to restore some of those former degraded areas. And so it's really this incorporation, going back to Dave's original slide with the whole defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts. That's exactly what's happening with respect to this woody expansion in the Great Plains, where instead of in the past, where we would work in areas that were already lost, right, where woodlands have already transitioned, instead of spending our resources there and by doing so, having all the dispersal and recruitment, expand many new areas, we flipped the entire script. So now we're working from right to left, where we're starting with treeless intact core areas. And then we're implementing prescribed fire where we could burn up seed and saplings before they're ever even, detected as far as resource concerns. This whole defend the core, grow the core, and then we'll continue to work on mitigate impacts. But by doing this, it will, have a complete opposite effect as far as being a very proactive and preventative way to address this threat. Dave?
Retaining grasslands in the Great Plains is paramount to framework success. The most productive soils in the Great Plains have already been cultivated, as shown on the left in red, based on cultivation risk. The right-hand graphic shows previously converted lands in gray, meaning that ongoing conversion in marginal soils is eating away at our last intact grasslands. Reduced crop yields in newly cultivated areas comes at a high cost to wildlife, water quality, soil health, and carbon storage. Rates of grassland loss in the prairie pothole regions of the Dakotas and Montana rival those of forest loss in the Brazilian Amazon. In total, 700 million grassland birds have been lost from this region, making them one of the most imperiled bird groups in the world. Next slide. Don't get me wrong, we love the Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP. Since 1985, CRP has incentivized grassland reestablishment, and rural communities have benefited from the $2 billion infusions from set-aside payments. New science, accepted for publication just last week, shows that CRP has helped to conserve 4.5 million grassland songbirds in the southern Great Plains. Still, despite the benefits of CRP, Tyler Lark's work at University of Wisconsin shows that we're still losing 1 million acres of grassland annually in the US. And with federal set aside acreage caps declining, competition is intense to stay in the program. Moreover, FSA supported science out of Virginia Tech suggests that more than half of willing landowners surveyed are unable to re-enroll expiring fields. This is concerning because acreage exiting CRP is the largest source of grassland loss in the nation. I'll repeat that last statement again so it sinks in. CRP is the largest source of grassland loss in the nation. Next slide. So the new idea in the Great Plains Framework is to help producers transition their expiring CRP to working lands. In one concise sentence, NRCS's approach is to retain grassland exiting CRP by replacing lost annual payments with revenues from livestock grazing. This is not a replacement for CRP, but rather NRCS's opportunity to help willing producers proactively retain their grasslands as a valued asset in their grazing operations. The opportunity for widespread adoption is high, as only 5% of fields coming out of CRP are enrolled in another program. And in a study by Kansas State University, landowner interest is high, as evidenced by a 58% rate of retention for almost 11,000 former CRP fields a decade after contract expiration. It may seem counterintuitive at first, but this same research shows that retention is twice as high in lower productivity landscapes where grazing cultures persist. A little help with a water or grazing system from NRCS could paste back together big pieces of formerly cultivated landscapes. And recall, transitioning CRP to grazing lands is a climate smart approach, resulting in that avoided cultivation of grasslands, or ACOGs. Next slide. Conservation easements are also an integral component of frameworks. Another feature of frameworks is our built-in section entitled Success Spotlights. The new Sagebrush framework spotlights Montana's leadership in using NRCS easements to perpetually conserve 250,000 acres of grazing lands. Many of these projects maintain the longest known sage grouse and pronghorn migrations in North America. And easements are a climate smart strategy too. Once again, under ACOGs by keeping carbon buried deep in underlying rangeland soils. And Tom Watson intends to keep his state's foot on the gas, telling us in his spotlight that the power of Montana partnerships is only limited by our ability to keep thinking big and moving together. Next slide. The Sagebrush framework encourages continued reduction of expanding woodlands into native rangeland. In these time-stamped photos on the right, you can see the slow and insidious expansion of pinyon juniper through time until restoration occurs at huge scales in 2020, oftentimes across public and private lands. As you peruse the frameworks, notice that each threat in the frameworks is accompanied by an anticipated outcomes section. In this instance, benefits of early PJ removal include increased resilience to fire, maintenance of grazing land productivity for ranching, a 12% documented increase in population growth rate for sage grouse, and a doubling of sagebrush obligate songbird populations. Next slide. Invasion of exotic annual grasses is a primary threat targeted for reduction in the sagebrush framework. Other Western states are joining Curtis Elke and his NRCS staff in Idaho to defend their state's uninvaded cores from annual grass conversion and to grow the size of those cores by attacking cheatgrass in nearby yellow prioritized areas in the target map shown on the right-hand graphic. At the heart of this strategy is knowing that invasive species control is more effective and cost efficient when done early, before infestations become widespread, and when management is informed by what's going on in their surrounding landscape. Key strategies include detection and prevention of early invasions, targeted herbicide use to eliminate or reduce invasive annual grass seed sources, and grazing management to maintain and promote perennial grass health. In recent news, the Western Governors Association, or WGA, has adopted this forward-looking defend the core and grow the core strategy for battling cheatgrass and are helping to scale up the crusade across the West. Next slide. On the range, water is life, and riparian, wet meadow, and other mesic areas are rare, but disproportionately important to wildlife and working lands. These areas are reservoirs of late season productivity, providing reliable water and forage for livestock and wildlife during dry summer and fall. Past degradation and dewatering have reduced their size and function, but new restoration and management approaches in the Sagebrush framework include improved riparian grazing management, low-tech restoration of degraded streams and meadows using Z-dike structures, beaver dam analogs, and conifer removal around headwater springs and meadows. Recent outcomes quantified by our Working Lands for Wildlife Science team show that restoration increases valley bottom productivity by 25% and keeps plants greener, leading to higher drought resiliency. Depicted here graphically on the left, restored sites build resiliency over time, whereby they eventually decouple from drought cycles. Literally in the lower left graphic, with years on the left axis and increased resiliency on the right, those dots are restoration sites and points in time where the longer they're on the landscape, their function and resiliency continues to improve until literally they decouple from drought. And Nick Silverman, the lead scientist on this work at University of Montana, said it best, quote, "Low-tech stream restoration helps put money in the piggy bank when it's wet so that wildlife, ranchers, and the ecosystem can draw upon the stored soil water during dry times." Back to you, Tim.
Thank you, Dave. So all told, when we look at the Great Plains grass, we aggregate what our 10 state conservationists submitted for their anticipated goals. We have 9.8 million acres that's primarily focused on two threats, that woodland expansion and land use conversion. Again, these are those big biome level threats that are driving loss and degradation. Similarly, when we look at the 11 states through the sagebrush biome, they also focus on woodland expansion and land use conversion, but they add exotic annual grass invasion, primarily cheatgrass, and the wet meadow degradation to the tune of about another 1.7 million acres. These frameworks, again, are focused on big threats that are impacting each of those biomes that we can move the needle on.